Hello everybody, my name is Tatiana Ryshova. I'm a lecturer at National Research University Higher School of Economics, and today we're going to have another webinar, another lesson, teacher training session on giving feedback to our learners, in particular when assessing their writing. And today we're going to focus on language teachers' professional reading skills, which are very specific to our profession and which we need when assessing our learners' writing and working with writing assessment scales. And as you remember, last time we talked quite a lot about the process of giving feedback to our learners and the process of assessing our learners' writing as a language teacher is one of the most complex and one of the most difficult and time and energy consuming language teachers' professional tasks, and it's one of the ways to optimize this process, to make our life easier and the whole process of assessing our learners' writing more exciting is to actually acquire some strategies of delivering feedback to our learners, and in particular of assessing their writing using assessment scales. But before we start, I would like to refresh in our memory some of the key features of effective feedback. Now, I will give you a couple of minutes to think of different features of effective feedback, the feedback that makes that helps our learners, that facilitates their process of working on their writing, and if it's oral feedback given as a result of assessing student speaking, that will help them to improve their speaking skills, right, and improve their performance on a next assignment. And so in one of our previous videos, actually in a sequence of our previous videos, we talked about the features of effective feedback. Now probably you have already had a chance to think of some features of effective feedback, and let's discuss them. So we talked about task involving feedback versus ego involving feedback, and it is a much more preferable way of commenting on our learners' writing is actually focusing on the task, right, rather than personal characteristics of our learner. When, for example, our learner John has submitted a piece of writing, it is much more preferable to say, John, this is a strong piece of writing in terms of, let's say, content and organization and the use of linking devices, but there is some room for improvement, obviously, and I suggest that you focus on the use of articles and probably on the use of present perfect and past simple tenses, rather than saying, John, you are such a smart boy, you are such a great student, keep up the good work because you're just pretty much the best in this class, right? This is not the way we want to give feedback to our learners, because this is much more demotivating than giving actually feedback, than commenting on the task achievement per se, right? Feedback should obviously be encouraging, because this is one of the functions of effective feedback, right? What do we mean by encouraging? How can we make our feedback encouraging? Well, first of all, we might, as you remember, formulate our feedback in a form of a little message to our learner, right? So instead of just letting our learner know what, like in just a very bold, impersonalized way what's good, and in particular what a lot of teachers do, they actually focus only on the negative aspects of the work, right? We might actually make it in the form of a little ongoing conversation between us and our learner, right? We might first of all focus on some positive aspects of the work, right? We might also give some constructive criticism, right? And we might actually let our learner know what can be done to improve, right? We might offer them a little action plan, and through our feedback we should always try to let our learner know that we're not their raters and assessors in the first place, but we're rather their if not friends, but we're there to help them, to facilitate their learning, right? To assist them. And so our students can trust us in a way and maybe open up a little bit, right? And when there is this thick wall between us and our learners, it's much easier to actually deliver that message to our learner and make that message be embraced and processed, right? Okay, our feedback should obviously be honest though, right? What important is that we do not praise our learner if there is actually nothing to praise our learner for their work if actually there is nothing to praise them for, right? Despite the fact that we should always try to be encouraging, right, and motivating, it's very important that we don't lie to our learners, right? It is very important that we still tell the truth and we're genuine, right? So you can always, in most cases, you can always find what to praise our learner for, or I mean the positive aspects of a work, but it is much, but if you can't, you then can probably write something or say something like, this is a good attempt, right? But you can't, you're here right now, and I'm pretty sure you can be here, and let's just think how we can work it out together, right? What can be done to help you improve, right? Or you can focus on the progress that has been made, right? Maybe the work per se is not very strong or didn't live up to your expectations, but there is always maybe in some aspects, or compared to previous pieces of writing, let's say, it is much better, and this is something you can focus on, right? So despite of trying to be positive and despite of the fact that your feedback should be encouraging, and one of the ways to make it encouraging is actually to start off with something good, right? You don't want to lie to our learner and mislead them, right? Our feedback should be well balanced, right? So it is a very, it is a very good idea to start off with something positive, right? As I have already said, then there is some place for constructive criticism, right? And then again something positive. In the ELT circles, they say that it's a good idea to wrap your feedback up by a little feed forward, right? So maybe wish them good luck on their next assignment, right? Or just say that it's always a pleasure to read every other piece of writing of theirs, because you clearly see that they're improving. Of course, if it is true. If it's not, you don't want to say that, right? How do we make our criticism constructive though? In some of our previous videos, we actually talked about constructive criticism being helpful criticism, right? So constructive means intended to help. Then how can we make our criticism helpful? First of all, by making it specific. Instead of saying poor grammar, we should probably say what in particular is not so good about this, the use of grammar, right? And more importantly, instead of just giving a little constatation of the fact that there are quite a lot of grammar mistakes in this piece of writing, we might want to offer them a little action plan, right? And suggest different ways of how this problem can be solved in our learners' subsequent pieces of writing, right? Our feedback should be selective, if possible. Again, there is no need to focus on every single problem of every single student when commenting on their every single piece of writing, right? Focus on from 2 to 4, maximum 5 features of the work, right? Both positive and negative. Because remember, if you are focused, our students are focused on their, let's say, problem areas, or on the aspects of their work that you want them to stick to in their subsequent writing. So by focusing your attention on certain aspects of our learners' work, we're focusing their attention on the very aspects, right? And feedback should be personalized, right? Students should not have this feeling that you are not actually thinking too much about how them in particular can improve, right? It shouldn't look like you're just copy-pasting the very same comment from one piece of writing to another. You just want to make your student feel that their writing matters to you, right? One of the ways to do it is actually think of their previous performance, maybe link to it, think of their maybe strengths and weaknesses that you have already commented on, right? And again, link your feedback to them. You might also, of course, address your student by name, right? And yeah, maybe even sign it with your name if you want to. Then we talked about different ways of correcting linguistic errors in our student writing, right? Which can be referred to as written corrective feedback. And can you think of some strategies of how to do that? Of some strategies which we can use to address our learners' mistakes in writing, their linguistic mistakes? Well, we talked about direct feedback and indirect feedback. We talked about them in a way that these two types of feedback differ, right? And the first and the main difference between them is that by giving direct feedback, we're actually letting our learner know what the correct way of writing is, right? We're actually correcting their mistakes by providing the correct way of formulating their idea, whereas when we use indirect feedback, we just let our students know that there is a mistake and we're not giving them the right answer. We want them to correct their mistakes themselves. Feedback can be focused and unfocused. If you remember, when we use focused feedback, we are focusing on some specific features of a writing, right? Maybe on some specific types of mistakes, right? Ignoring all the other mistakes that might have been made in the very same piece of writing. It can be effective, especially if we are marking a piece of writing that has been produced right after you studied, let's say, a certain grammar topic, right? And you just gave this writing assignment to get your student to practice the newly acquired grammar rule, for example, right? Feedback can be unfocused, which means you're not focusing on any specific types of mistakes. You're just correcting pretty much everything that can be corrected, right? Alright, feedback can be meta-linguistic, which means we are providing our learner with some linguistic information about the mistakes that were made when producing this piece of writing, right? It can be done via error codes or via writing meta-linguistic comments to have a look at the example of how to do that, or at maybe some most common error codes that are generally used in the world of ELT nowadays. You can refer to one of our previous videos. And feedback can be delivered in the form of reformulation, when you're basically rewriting a piece of writing, just a sentence, or maybe a part of a sentence that contains a mistake, or very often mistakes, in a more natural way. You don't want to overuse this strategy because you don't want to rewrite actually the mistakes, the whole piece of writing, right? Correcting mistakes. You just want to focus maybe on some bits and pieces of your students' writing using this error correction strategy, right? And when you use reformulation, there is a big risk that you might appropriate your learner's text by reformulating their ideas, probably because the language that has been used to produce them is erroneous. You might actually change their ideas a little bit because you might just not understand what your student meant exactly, and you don't want to do that, right? Your main aim is to help your student formulate their ideas, not changing their ideas along with the language. Now, today we're actually going to focus more on the use of assessment scales when assessing our learners' longer pieces of writing. And as you remember, we have already discussed different hardships that we might have when assessing longer pieces of writing of our learners, and one of them is that it is really time consuming. And as I've already mentioned today, one of the ways to make it less time consuming is actually acquire some strategies of how to do it. Another problem that we mentioned again in our previous video is that it's sometimes hard to stay objective, and again it's by acquiring some strategies of how to work with and how to read assessment scales, we might actually make our process of marking student writing more effective and learn how to be more objective. Now, when assessing our learners' writing using assessment scales, we're usually focusing on some aspects of that piece of writing. And can you please think right now what these aspects are? What are the main criteria which we are focusing on when assessing our learners' writing using assessment criteria? You might think of state exams, ОГЭ and ЕГЭ. What are the assessment criteria, right, that we are looking at when assessing our learners' letters and essays? Well, usually it is content, right? And here we'll look at how well, if our student has actually covered all the points in the task, right? If they have done the task that basically was given to them, right? Then it is communicative achievement, and here we just look at how well this piece of writing matches the piece of writing required by the task, right? Then it is usually organization, right? So here we look at different linking devices that our learners used when organizing their ideas in the text in their piece of writing, right? We might look at the way they divided their piece of writing into paragraphs. We might look at whether these paragraphs are actually, whether their text is divided into paragraphs logically, right? And language, right? And here it can be again divided into several smaller criteria, right? Like lexis, grammar, spelling, punctuation. Now I would like you to think and let us know in the comment section down below what approach do you usually take when assessing longer pieces of writing of your learner, and I would like you to think what are the stages that you stick to, or what are the stages in the process of assessing writing in your case or in your experience. What do you do first? What do you do next? How do you make this process maybe more efficient? And please let us know of the staging of the process of assessing your learners' writing using assessment criteria. Now, there exist some recommendations on how to do that, and of course I'm not going to impose anything on you right now. I'm just going to share what we have found when researching this question in the literature, right, in scientific research papers on the topic of assessing student writing and giving feedback and responding to student writing when teaching English as a foreign language. And the staging offered in research journals is more or less the following. The first stage is actually reading the assessment scale first, because this is something, especially if you're teaching group, this is something you're going to use when assessing multiple pieces of writing, right? So you need to make sure that when you start reading your student's piece of writing, you already know what you're maybe looking for in this piece of writing, right? So you read, actually it is reading the task and the assessment scale. And when working with an assessment scale, it is a good idea to actually highlight the words that make every single level in this assessment scale differ from the previous level for each of the criteria given. And you might actually want to highlight those words. Now, of course, I understand that most of you already know your assessment criteria, because very often we prepare our learners, especially nowadays, to actually two very specific pieces of writing, right, which is writing letters and writing essays. And we know our assessment criteria pretty well, right, state exam assessment criteria. But here, although we will use a sample student state exam essay as an example, where actually these strategies are more general and aim at helping you to learn how to use all sorts of different assessment scales, including Cambridge exams assessment scales at different levels. from A1 to C1 or maybe C2, because they all differ. And again, if you're working with a new assessment scale which you have never worked with, it is a good idea to start off the process of using it with highlighting the difference between different levels. Then it's time to turn to your students' actual piece of writing, and researchers and methodologists suggest that you start off by reading your student's piece of writing without marking it. You can do it you can do it in a way that is pretty cursory, right? So you just give a cursory look, right, to the whole piece of writing, just to make sure that content-wise and structure-wise it lives up to the standard and to the task. In terms of, in particular when we're talking about state exam, that it is of appropriate length, right? This is something that we should not remember, that we should always remember, right? After you've written your student's piece of writing, you can look at the assessment criteria once again and assess your students, the content of this piece of writing and organization. Having done that, you go back to this piece of writing and start marking it, and now it is the process of assessing the language per se, and you just start correcting mistakes or highlighting mistakes using the strategies probably that we discussed earlier on this course. And having done that, you turn back to the assessment criteria, in particular to the criteria that refer to the language used in this piece of writing, and you assess the linguistic side of this piece of writing. Having done that, you provide your learner with feedback, which is an integral part of the process of assessing student writing and giving feedback. Now, we're going to try to follow those stages right now together, and here we have assessment criteria for the written part of the Russian state exam in English. And what I would like you to do right now is actually to follow the first stage of the process of assessing your learners' writing using assessment scales, which is highlighting the difference between different levels for each of the assessment criteria. Now, here, right now, you can see only two assessment criteria, which are, now I will probably have to switch to Russian, right, because the assessment criteria for the Russian state exam are given in Russian, so which are решение коммуникативной задачи, or communicative achievement in English, and text organization, or организация текста. And right now I would like you to take 2 minutes and look at all the 4 levels, right, 0, 1, 2, 3, for either of these 2 criteria, and highlight or at least think of those keywords that make you or help you understand the difference between, let's say, the level at which you give your learner 3 points and 2 points, 2 points and 1 point, 1 point and 0 points. So will you please right now look through these descriptors carefully and think of the keywords. So. All right. So for the first assessment criteria now, I will switch to Russian. Решение коммуникативной задачи. Первый и выделенный фрагмент дескриптора. Задание выполнено полностью, задание выполнено в основном, задание выполнено не полностью, задание не выполнено является, пожалуй, ключевым, и ключевые слова в данном случае выделены желтым, right? Полностью, в основном, не полностью, не выполнено. Now, you probably understand that this is a bit too general, right? What does it mean fully, полностью? What does it mean in general? I think it might actually mean different things for different teachers, right? What means fully to me might mean more or less in general to other teachers, right? So therefore there's given a detailization, right? A specification of this assessment criteria. The content, right, reflects all the aspects given in the task. All the aspects, все аспекты in this case is a keyword, because if we have a look at the very same criterion at level 2, we have only 2 aspects. So this is probably something that you want to highlight when working with an assessment scale, right? So it's highlighted in green. All aspects and 2 aspects. You see that if you work like that, if you do actually highlight these bits of text in the descriptors compared to this, when you don't have anything highlighted, it's actually much more, it's actually much easier, right, to use these assessment criteria later on. Then, as for the style, стилевое оформление речи выполнено правильно. So we can mark the word style, стилевое, to let us know what this bit of this descriptor refers to. And the word правильно, right, correctly, appropriately, because this is basically the way it should be done to get 3 points at this level, right? There can be only one kind of mistake or stylistic inappropriacy, right? Только одно нарушение. And this is our keyword which we want to highlight. We don't want to highlight the word допускается. We don't want to highlight the word нейтрального стиля, because this is the word which is repeated at all the levels, right? We just want to highlight something that should stand out in this descriptor for us, right? At the level 2, well, obviously we highlight the words в основном правильно, right? We might actually, we don't even have to highlight the words стилевое оформление, because this is something that we highlight in the previous descriptor, right, at the level 3. And as you can see, I decided to do it in 3 different colors, and this is something that again helps me understand what I'm looking for when using these descriptors, right? And if it is only 1 inappropriacy at level 3, it is 2 or 3 inappropriacies are allowed at level 2, and 4 inappropriacies, 4 нарушения of the style are allowed at level 4, and there is nothing about it at level 0, right? At the level 0 we highlighted probably the most, one of the most important bits is that if it is 30% or more copied from elsewhere, if 30% of the text or more was not written by the student, by our student themselves, this is what we give 0 for, right? As for the text organization, we are focusing here on how logical this piece of writing is. So if it's logical, логично, we give 3. If it's generally logical, we give 2, right? So that's why в основном is a key word in this case. If it is generally logical, it means by the developers of this assessment, writing assessment scale, that 1 or 2 in a processes are allowed. At level 1, 3 or 4 in a processes are allowed, and at level 0, 5 and more in a processes are allowed. Now again, I would like you to understand what I'm focusing on right now is the strategy that you can use to appropriate, well, the scale of writing assessment that you're using, right? I'm not focusing on how to assess state exam writing right now. I'm focusing on how to use the assessment scale of any type, and I'm using the assessment scale for Russian state exam assessment as an example. So the second criterion, K2, also focuses on how the text is divided into paragraphs, right? So if it is divided into paragraphs the way it should, we give it 3 points, right? And according to the plan, obviously. If there are 2, 3 in a processes, I've highlighted this bit of the descriptor in red, right? We give it 2 points. If there are 3 or more in a processes or logical breakdowns when dividing this text into paragraphs, we give it 1. And if the text is not divided into paragraphs, or if there are it is not logical at all, the way our student decided to divide it into paragraphs, we give it 0. Well, that I'm pretty sure you know these assessment criteria scales. I'm just sharing the way you can mark them to help you understand them better and remember what each assessment criteria at every single level focuses on. Now we're going to look at 3 more assessment criteria within this assessment scale, which has the use of lexis, grammar, and spelling and punctuation. And I'm going to give you another 2 minutes, and you mark this assessment scale to yourself the way we have just done it with the first 2 criteria, K1 and K2. Now, if you want to, you can actually pause this video, and if you have a writing assessment scale at hand, you get writing assessment scale, you can actually pick it up and then when going back to watching this video, you can actually mark it using the real assessment scale that you have maybe printed out. So I think we can. All right, and this is the way I did it. As we can see, for lexis, there is only 1 mistake allowed at the level of 3 points, right? At the level at which we give our learner 3 points for vocabulary, and this is something that I highlighted. I actually you might not even want to highlight "практически нет нарушений в использовании лексики" because it's a bit late. What vague? What does it mean? Практически, almost. It might not actually be that useful for you as a bit of the information, right? What important here is that only one mistake is allowed at this level, whereas at the level of 2 points, 2 or 3 mistakes are allowed, or the vocabulary range is quite limited, right? But the vocabulary units are used accurately. So 2 or 3 mistakes or quite limited vocabulary unit, right? At level 1, 4 vocabulary mistakes, and although we have a bit above, используемый словарный запас не вполне соответствует высокому уровню сложности задания. That is a bit vague again. Obviously, at level 1, it is not really, it does not really match the vocabulary range, and the complexity of the vocabulary units might not really meet the requirements and the complexity level. But what is important here is that there are 4 mistakes, 4 or more mistakes, or actually 4, no more than 4 mistakes is level 1. And at level 0, it's 5 or more vocabulary mistakes. So this is something that should stand out for you in these descriptors. All the information given is important, but this is something, after you have read it all, this is something that you might want to mark in the assessment scale. Just because this is something that should stand out for you, when you're marking student writing, you go back to the assessment scale and you say, okay, so 3, 2, 3, it's level 2. And then you go back to marking, right? As we did it in quite a similar way with grammar. You can have a look at it. And because spelling and punctuation are combined in the 5th assessment criterion, K5, we decided to match them together, we decided and use different colors, right? So there are 2 or 3, 4 spelling mistakes allowed at level 1, with only 1 spelling mistake or 1 punctuation mistake allowed at level 2, and 5 or more spelling and or punctuation mistakes at level 0 is obviously 0. Now, this is again just the way you can mark assessment scales, just a strategy to practice your professional reading skill, which is very specific to our profession of language learners, the skill of reading assessment scales. Now, after we have familiarized ourselves with the assessment scale, we might actually have a look at a sample student essay question, so right now we're actually going to have a look at a sample essay, and the topic is in front of you. Some people say that traveling to exotic countries is an exciting experience, and the plan for this essay is the following. Our students should make an introduction, state the problem paraphrasing the given statement, express their opinion given 2-3 reasons, express an opposing opinion given 1-2 reasons, explain why they think that this opinion is not the one that they would like to share, and make a conclusion restating their position, right? And obviously, well, you can then have a look at a sample student essay, which I'm going to give you right now. Will you please take 2 minutes to look through the whole essay and just to get general impression of how well this student has achieved the aim of writing an essay as an answer to the task which we have just looked at. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to look at this essay and form the general impression of this piece of writing. I think we can start. Alright, after reading a piece of writing for the first time without marking, this is what research suggests, we might have a look at the communicative achievement here, and let's actually think of what band those levels are very often referred to in the ELT world as band in the assessment criteria. So what band can be assigned in terms of communicative achievement to this piece of writing? Now, do you think that this task is fully reflects all points given in the task? Now, or in the plan, if you forget if you forgot what they are, you might always refer back to the task. I have a sample task at Forward English student book on page 132. Here is a sample writing assessment, essay question for a state exam, and the plan is usually the same, so I'm going to have a look at it over here. So there should be an introduction, and I think it is obvious that there is one, right? Nowadays traveling has become an important part of our life. Some people have preferred traveling to unusual countries because it brings a lot of positive emotions to them, but others do not support to go to fascinating far-off destinations. Now, we're not focusing on language just yet. There is a paragraph where our learner expresses their personal opinion, right? Personally, I think exotic travels are always amazing, to go off the beaten track adventures to the most interesting corners of the world. First of all, you can see exotic sights, scenic landscapes and beautiful festivals. Secondly, you can try unusual dishes just such as snails, mussels, shrimps, octopus, spiders and fruits. Moreover, you can discover exotic animal and take a wonderful picture. Now let's see how many ideas, how many arguments are given over here. We can see the first one, right, where our learner states that we can go to far-off destinations just because we can admire exotic sights, right? Another reason to go to exotic countries is that we can try unusual food, and this is fair enough. And the first argument is that we can discover exotic animal and take wonderful pictures. Now, obviously, because of the language, it is not quite clear what our learner meant, but we are assuming that their argument is that you can see a lot of wonderful creatures and different animals. Now, there is a problem with the language, but the argument isn't there. You really can go to exotic countries to see the animals which you will never find in your country, right? So we have three arguments here, which actually means that our student has been following the plan so far. Express an opposing opinion and give 1-2 reasons for the opposing opinion. Let's have a look at the way our learner expressed opposing opinion. However, some people do not agree with my point of view. According to them, many exotic countries have ecological problems. There is a lack of fresh air and dirty water. So probably this is something that might deter people from going to exotic countries. Moreover, there is a risk of getting some dangerous disease, so doctors strongly advise people to get vaccinated. Well, disease is actually another, a possibility of getting dangerous disease is another thing which might make us not want to go to exotic countries, and so probably we can count them as 2 reasons why our why some people believe that going to exotic countries is not a very appealing idea. Let's see if our student is able to refute these 2 counter arguments. So I can't agree with this opinion because you can take some measures to protect yourself. You might be wearing a mask to avoid drinking tap water. And yes, probably this is this refers to this counter argument 1, right? So there are some ecological problems and lack of fresh air and the danger of drinking dirty water, and yeah, you can wear a mask and avoid drinking tap water and you might be fine in this case. And so the second counter argument, as for the risk of it, doctors can ensure that and therefore you will not fall sick. Now again, there is a problem with the language, but our learner attempted at refuting the argument that a risk of getting a dangerous disease can be something that will deter a lot of tourists from going to exotic countries. So let's assume that our learner has refuted both counter arguments, and now our student is supposed to make a conclusion restating their position. In conclusion, many tourists who started traveling cannot stop because it is very exciting and enjoyable. Now, what is the position of our learner here? Obviously, from introduction, we can understand that our learner is in favor of traveling to unusual countries, but this is not what they state in their conclusion, and actually they're even starting a new topic a little bit in their conclusion, saying that tourists can't stop traveling once they start traveling to exotic countries, which does not really match the topic of the essay, and I'm afraid this conclusion is not valid, and this is one of the aspects of the content which was not fully or properly covered. So I think that if we have a look at the assessment criteria, right, on my slide, we can see that it's definitely not band 3 and probably band 1 right for now, right? This is one aspect of the task which is not fully covered, or band 1, one aspect of the task which is not covered. Now, I believe that in this piece of writing, conclusion does not really match. In conclusion, our learner does not really restate their position. They just go off topic, which means that this aspect is not really covered. Now, let's have a look at the way our learner managed to stick to the formal style, right, which is suitable for this type of writing, right? This is not an informal letter, this is an essay, an academic essay, and the style here should be formal. Now, have you been able to find any inappropriateness over here? Well, some people say that when writing academic essays, it is not a good idea to start sentences with but, and also. This is more suitable for informal pieces of writing. So this is one of the stylistic inappropriateness in this piece of writing. And another very common way of how our learners kind of lean away a bit from formal writing is using contractions, and here we can see one, right? I can't instead of cannot, which is appropriate for informal pieces of writing, but not really for formal pieces of writing. So we can see here two inappropriateness when it comes to the style, so it is somewhere in between band 2 and band 1, probably closer to band 1, because there is conclusion, it is just not very well formulated, and there can be added a bit of the information to make it more suitable for the overall piece of writing. And there are two instances of the stylistic breakdown, right, in this piece of writing. Now we're going to have another assessment criteria, which is text organization, and I think that we can comment on it right now. Do you agree that in terms of the text organization, the text is this particular piece of writing is divided into 5 paragraphs. Logically, well, obviously there is an introduction, there is a paragraph where our learner shares their opinion, there is a paragraph where they give counter arguments, a paragraph where they refute counter arguments, and a conclusion, which is a bit problematic, but still it is there. So overall, it is logical. Now, let's have a look at the way our learner used different stylistic devices. Well, we can see introductory and linking words here, like personally, and then we have first of all, secondly, and moreover, then however, again moreover, and in conclusion. So overall, they're used quite logically. Next, as for going back to the assessment criteria, the logical organization of the text, we can say that in terms of the organization of the text and its division into the paragraph, it is correct. But let's have a look at logic. When reading this article, when reading this essay, you might have detected a few logical mistakes. Now again, this is something to discuss, but what I was not really sure of, what our learner meant was here. Let's have a look at the counter arguments that our learner gives, right? Some people might not want to travel to exotic countries because exotic countries have ecological problems. There is a lack of fresh air and dirty water. First of all, that might be referred to as language, right? But that sounds quite funny. There is a lack of fresh air and dirty water. But what's so bad about the lack of dirty water, right? But we can look at it as a linguistic inappropriacy, right? Which still kind of affects the logic of this counter argument, right? And there is a risk of getting some dangerous disease. So doctors advise people to get vaccinated. And then if we look at the way our learner refutes these arguments, right? They offer some suggest some measures that can be taken. For example, wearing a mask. You might be wearing a mask and avoid drinking tap water. As for the risk of it, and from this piece of over here, it's not really clear what it refers to because it is quite far away from the argument per se, right? Doctors can ensure that, and again, it's not quite clear what is meant by that. Now we might assume that it is the risk of getting some dangerous disease, but if doctors ensure that, that means that doctors can do everything to make sure that one gets a dangerous disease, right? Again, the language sometimes overlaps with the use of references like it and that here, and it creates some misunderstanding over here. So this is obviously, it is clear what our student was trying to say, but in the way it is formulated, it does not seem quite logical over here. Using references inappropriate might really affect the logic. Going back to the counter argument by the way, to the first one, according to people who do not agree with, who do not share the point of view of our learners and think that it is not a good idea to travel to exotic countries, their first argument is that many countries have ecological problems. There is a lack of fresh air and dirty water. To make it more logical, it might actually be a good idea to wrap this counter argument up and say, so it might actually be quite dangerous to go to exotic countries, right? It can affect your health, right, or your experience, because we really want to formulate those arguments in the light of our essay topic, right? However, that can be formulated in the following way. According to these people, many exotic countries have ecological problems. There is a lack of fresh air and dirty water. Now, there might be a lack of fresh air and dirty water, but it might still be an interesting place to go, right? Which can spoil your experience. And here we'll link again this essay to the topic of traveling. Quite insignificant, but still logical breakdowns in this piece of writing. Now, if we go back to the criterion with the text organization, we might actually look into at band 2 over here, right? The text is overall logical. There is one or two logical mistakes, and there are two inappropriacies when it comes to the style, right? Now we'll have a look at the last 2-3 assessment criteria. Here are lexis, grammar, and spelling and punctuation. We'll have a cursory look at those and at our essay, and let's think of what might be said in terms of the lexis and grammar. I suggest that we take 1 minute to look through this essay. If you need a bit longer, you can pause, and then we'll discuss lexis, grammar, and spelling and punctuation over here. Now, if you need a bit more time to look to look at the language and to detect some linguistic mistakes in this piece of writing, you can always take it by pausing this video. Right now, we we'll just look at the language together, and we might actually use some error correction strategies that we talked about in our previous videos. And let me give you some context. Let's think of this student as our student who is preparing to take a state exam in the nearest future, and we're assessing this piece of writing to just give them feedback that will be helping in their further preparation for this exam. Now, do you think we should provide them with direct or indirect feedback? Obviously, it depends a lot on your preferences and on the preferences of your learner, more importantly. But I would suggest that if it's just an ongoing process of practicing writing essays, it can be a good idea to provide our learner with indirect feedback, which means just letting our learners know that there are some mistakes in this piece of writing, and actually giving an opportunity to our learner to correct them themselves. And as for focused and unfocused, I suggest that we stick to the unfocused strategy, because we just want to let our learner know where they are at this stage of preparing for their state exam. And finally, I suggest that we go with the meta-linguistic feedback, and we provide our learner with some air codes which will help them understand what their maybe problematic areas are in terms of the language once they go back to this piece of writing. Now, to mark the language, I'm actually going to take another version of this essay. So my previous marking, the marking that I have done previously, does not disturb you, right? Now, let's have a look at the vocabulary. Please share in the comment section down below what you think. But again, here we're not focusing too much on training teachers, or us training ourselves to assess state exam in particular. We're rather using it as a sample piece of writing. And we're also focusing on using different error correction strategies, right? And the skill of detecting mistakes. Now, as for vocabulary, we remember that it is a good idea to comment not only on negative aspects of the work, but also on positive. I would say that there are actually some nice, less common vocabulary units, like, for example, go off the beaten track. Now, it might be used with some mistakes around it, but we might comment on the attempt at using less common lexes, which is great, right? So that might be something that we might want to focus on when giving a final comment to our learner, right? What else can we focus on here? There are some rare names for different sea creatures, right? Which is also nice. So our learner shows that they know some less common vocabulary units. Far off destination is also quite a nice vocabulary unit to use, though with a little spelling mistake, right? It's better to write it with a hyphen. Let's have a look at some inaccuracies probably here too. To go off the beaten track, and you can see that there is a word repeated twice, right? And I think exotic travels are always amazing to go off the beaten track adventures. Now, we should probably let our student know that they can either say to go on adventures or to go off the beaten track, and in this case adventures might not be is not really needed. Now if we want to let our student know that both ways of saying it, and this is actually should probably be the way to go, we might put a little star over here and write a little meta-linguistic comment to our learner over here, saying that you can go on adventures but go on off the beaten track without a word adventures later on, right? And without any prepositions. To go off the beaten track, or to have adventures, to have an adventurous trip, right? You can't really go on adventures. You can have some adventures, or enjoy some adventures, right? As for grammar, we might actually see some syntactic inaccuracies over here. Some people prefer traveling to unusual countries because it brings a lot of positive emotions to them, but others do not support, and something is missing here, support or, well, the idea of going, or probably I would even mark it as a verb, as a mistake in the verb, right? The verb use, because after support we need a gerund, support going. I'm not going to correct it right now because we're using indirect corrective feedback with air quotes, right? Support going, and there is also a preposition missing, right? Support going to fascinating, far off destination. So there is also a preposition missing and a spelling mistake. So we can mark these far off destinations as spelling. Personally, I think exotic travels are always amazing to go off the beaten track. The most interesting corners of the world. First of all, you can see exotic sights, scenic landscapes, and beautiful festivals, first of all. Secondly, you can try unusual dishes such as snails, mussels, shrimps, and then we have octopus in singular for some reason, should probably be in plural, spiders, and fruit, which is uncountable. And this is a mistake in the use of a noun, right? And an uncountable noun. We may mark it as A-U-N or just N. This is another mistake with the use of a noun. You can discover exotic animal, and here it's not quite clear why exotic animal. Only one exotic animal? Or there should be exotic animals, right? So probably it is another mistake in the use of a noun. And take a wonderful picture. Why one? Not really clear. We might also highlight it and put a little question mark to ask our student later on. However, some people do not agree with my point of view. According to them, many exotic countries have ecological problems. There is a lack of fresh water and dirty water. Probably this is breakdown in logic. This is something that we have already discussed, but we might just let our learner know that they might add a little bit over here to make it more logical, right? Moreover, there is a risk of getting some dangerous disease, or add dangerous disease might be a better idea. We can just suggest them this way of putting it. So doctors strongly advise people to get vaccinated. Another nice vocabulary unit, right, to get vaccinated. I can't agree with this opinion because you can take some measures to protect yourself. You might be wearing. Now, this is a use of a modal verb, and we can actually compliment our learner for attempting to use a more complex grammar structure, but not quite accurately right now, and we can put a little M, which stands for modal verb over here, right? You might wear a mask, or you can actually say you can wear a mask because this is, well, the opportunity you have, right? And avoid drinking tap water. As for the risk of it, doctors can ensure that, and again, there is a syntactic problem which causes a breakdown in logic, can ensure that you do not get sick when traveling, right? Some bit of a sentence is missing, which prevents it from being logical, right? And therefore, you will not fall sick. In conclusion, many tourists now will still check this conclusion, though it is a bit off topic, who started traveling, and this is probably, well, this is a mistake in the use of a tense, right? Because there is there is no time reference over here. When did they start traveling? We don't really know. So present perfect is needed because it is very exciting and enjoyable. There are also quite a few spelling mistakes. For example, nowadays, right? The very first word in this sentence is spelled incorrectly. We have already commented on far-off destinations over here, and we will look at punctuation right away. There is a linking word therefore without commas, which should be there, right? Because, well, this is the way we make linking words stand out, especially in the middle of a sentence. But when it comes to this bit, in conclusion, many tourists who started traveling, if we follow proper grammar rules, now that might be a bit too challenging for our learners at this level, but this is a non-defining relative. This is a defining relative clause, which means that commas are not needed here. Many tourists cannot stop because it is very exciting and enjoyable. Does not make sense, which means that this part of a sentence cannot be omitted, so commas are not needed. Many tourists who started traveling cannot stop because it is very exciting and enjoyable. Now, that might be a bit too hard of a grammar rule for our learner at this point, but you can just let them know that commas are not needed here, right? And they might remember and not make this mistake in their subsequent pieces of writing. So we have quite a few grammar mistakes, right? Definitely more than 5, about 6. So it will probably be band 1 for grammar, and as for vocabulary, there is actually one more mistake. We cannot discover, right? If we have a look at the pieces of writing again, something that I meant to mark, but I didn't. You can discover exotic animals. Now, if you discover exotic animals, you are the first one to find them, which is very unlikely, so it's a wrong word. And as for the vocabulary, our learner did attempt at using some less common and more complex vocabulary units with a few inaccuracies over here. There is one wrong word, and if we go back to our assessment criteria Lexis, we can say that, well, there are two inaccuracies, but overall the vocabulary does match the quite a complex level required for performing this task, so that will probably be band 2. And as for spelling and punctuation, we can see that there are 2 spelling mistakes. Therefore, if we have a look at our marked piece of writing, this is 1 mistake, 1 punctuation inaccuracy. This word should be written with 2 commas on both sides, so it's 1 mistake. Another punctuation mistake. We have a spelling mistake here and a spelling mistake here. So if we go back to the assessment criteria, we have about 4 mistakes overall, 2 spelling and 2 punctuation mistakes. So it will probably be band 1, 2 spelling and 2 punctuation mistakes. Now, this experience of assessing an essay using assessment criteria right now was not aimed at teaching you or training you to assess state exam writing. It was rather to share a strategy of how to read assessment scales and how to make the process of reading them and using them easier for you by highlighting different levels, by looking at your student writing stage by stage. You can ensure that you are more, you might stay more objective and more accurate when assigning bands. And we are still very much interested in the way you usually perform this professional task of assessing student writing using assessment scales. And in this video we just shared our strategy with you, and we hope that it might be helpful to some of you. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in our next video.